The photograph was taken on July 19, 1862, in the basement of the Blandford Church in Petersburg, Virginia, which had been converted into a makeshift embalming facility for Confederate casualties from the 7 days battles that had just ended, with over 20,000 combined casualties. The photographer, likely a Union spy documenting Confederate operations, captured the image in approximately 50 seconds of exposure time using stolen photographic plates. What the image shows is a black man in work clothes standing beside a wooden embalming table where a Confederate officer's body lies, surrounded by glass bottles, metal instruments, and the chemical apparatus necessary for arterial preservation. What the photograph cannot reveal is that the man performing this delicate work was named Solomon Richards, that he was enslaved property valued at $1,200 in his owner's estate ledgers, and that over the next 3 years he would embalm 312 Confederate soldiers, charge their families an average of $15 per body, accumulate $4,680 in a hidden account, and eventually purchase freedom for himself, his wife, and his 3 children, using money earned from preserving the bodies of men who had died fighting to keep him enslaved. Solomon Richards was 34 years old, stood 6 feet tall, weighed approximately 175 pounds, and had spent the first 31 years of his life as property of Dr. Charles Blandford, a physician who owned a small medical practice and 3 enslaved people in Petersburg. Dr. Blandford had trained in Philadelphia in the 1830s, when embalming was still an experimental procedure, had learned the French method of arterial injection using arsenic-based preservatives, and had brought this knowledge back to Virginia, where he performed occasional embalmings for wealthy families who wanted their deceased relatives preserved for extended mourning periods or transport to distant burial locations. Solomon had worked as Dr. Blandford's medical assistant since age 15, initially performing menial tasks like cleaning instruments and mixing chemicals, but gradually learning anatomy, surgical techniques, and the precise chemistry required to preserve human tissue without discoloration or premature decomposition. The body on Solomon's table that July morning belonged to Captain Thomas Whitmore, age 29, a Confederate officer from a wealthy Hanover County family who'd been killed at the Battle of Malvern Hill on July 1, 1862, when a Union artillery shell exploded near his position and shrapnel penetrated his chest. Captain Whitmore had died instantly, according to the battlefield report. His body then buried in a shallow grave with dozens of other casualties because the July heat made it impossible to transport corpses without immediate preservation. 18 days later, when the battlefield was finally secure enough for family members to recover bodies, the Whitmore family had hired gravediggers to exhume their son, transported him to Petersburg in a sealed wagon, and paid Dr. Blandford $18 for embalming services that would allow the captain to be buried in the family cemetery with a proper funeral. $18 was a substantial sum in 1862 Virginia, equivalent to approximately 3 weeks' wages for a skilled tradesman. But the Whitmore family was wealthy and grief-stricken and willing to pay whatever was necessary to bury their son at home rather than leave him in an anonymous battlefield grave. Dr. Blandford had accepted the commission immediately because he needed the money, and because he'd realized within days of the 7 days battles ending that there would be dozens, possibly hundreds, of similar requests from families across Virginia who wanted their dead soldiers preserved and transported home. But Blandford was 68 years old with arthritis in his hands that made surgical work difficult and time-consuming. So he'd made a decision that would change Solomon's life. He would allow his enslaved assistant to perform the embalming independently, charge full price to the families, and pay Solomon $2 per body as incentive for quality work. "Solomon, you understand what I'm offering you?" Dr. Blandford had said 3 days earlier, on July 16th, when the first request from the Whitmore family arrived. They were standing in the church basement that Blandford had rented for $5 per month because his medical office was too small to handle the volume of bodies he anticipated. The basement was approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, with stone walls that kept the temperature cool even in summer, small ground-level windows that provided natural light, and a dirt floor that could absorb spilled fluids without permanent staining. Blandford had equipped the space with 2 wooden embalming tables, shelves for storing chemicals and instruments, a coal stove for heating water, and drainage gutters that led to a cesspit in the corner. The setup was crude by modern standards, but sophisticated for 1862 Virginia, and it represented everything Solomon needed to perform embalming work that would be indistinguishable from what any trained white undertaker could produce. "I understand, Dr. Blandford." Solomon had responded carefully, keeping his voice respectful and his eyes downcast in the manner that white Virginians expected from enslaved people. "You want me to do the embalming work? You'll handle the family consultation and collect the payment, and I'll receive $2 per body. That's generous, sir, considering you're not obligated to pay me anything at all." The words were chosen to show appropriate deference, while simultaneously acknowledging the transaction's economic reality. Solomon would be performing skilled medical labor that few people in Virginia could execute competently, and Blandford would be collecting money for work he wasn't actually doing. The arrangement was exploitative by any reasonable standard, but it was also an opportunity that most enslaved people never received. The chance to accumulate money through skilled labor and possibly, eventually, purchase freedom. The science of embalming in 1862 was primitive compared to modern mortuary practice, but revolutionary compared to the rapid burial that had been standard for centuries. The human body begins decomposing within hours of death as bacteria in the digestive system, particularly the colon, start consuming tissue from the inside out. Enzymes that normally aid in digestion begin breaking down the intestinal walls, allowing bacteria to spread into the bloodstream and throughout the body. Within 24 hours, this process produces gases that cause visible bloating, discoloration that turns skin greenish-purple, and odors that become increasingly unbearable. In July heat, with temperatures reaching 95 degrees Fahrenheit, an unembalmed corpse became unviewable within 1 day, and a serious health hazard within 2 days as decomposition accelerated and bacterial load increased exponentially. Embalming halted this decomposition by replacing blood with chemical preservatives that killed bacteria and fixed proteins in a way that prevented tissue breakdown. The procedure required surgical access to the circulatory system, typically through the carotid artery in the neck or the femoral artery in the groin. A hollow metal tube called a trocar was inserted into the artery, connected via rubber tubing to a gravity-fed reservoir containing preservative fluid, and the fluid was allowed to flow through the arterial system while blood drained from a corresponding incision in a nearby vein. The preservative fluid in 1862 consisted primarily of arsenic trioxide dissolved in grain alcohol, a mixture that was highly toxic to both living bacteria and living humans, but remarkably effective at preserving dead tissue. A typical embalming required 2 to 3 gallons of preservative solution and took approximately 2 to 3 hours to complete, depending on body size and condition. Solomon had learned this procedure through 19 years of assisting Dr. Blandford, watching approximately 140 embalmings performed on various deceased Petersburg residents, and occasionally being allowed to perform simple tasks like inserting the drainage tube or monitoring fluid flow while Blandford handled the more complex surgical aspects. But Solomon had never performed a complete embalming independently until July 19, 1862, when he stood alone in the Blandford church basement with Captain Thomas Whitmore's body and all the responsibility for ensuring the procedure succeeded. Failure would mean the body decomposing before it could be transported to Hanover County, the Whitmore family being unable to have a proper funeral, and Dr. Blandford losing both the $18 fee and his reputation as a reliable embalmer. Solomon began by examining the body carefully, assessing the condition and identifying challenges that would affect the embalming procedure. Captain Whitmore had been dead for 18 days, buried in a shallow battlefield grave for 17 of those days, and exhumed yesterday. The summer heat had accelerated decomposition despite the burial, producing visible bloating in the abdomen, discoloration in the extremities, and the beginning of skin slippage on the hands and face. These were signs of moderate decomposition, not severe enough to make embalming impossible, but serious enough to require extra care and probably additional cavity treatment beyond standard arterial injection. Solomon noted that the captain's chest wound, caused by shrapnel, had been packed with cloth by field medics but never properly sutured, leaving a ragged opening approximately 3 inches long that would need to be cleaned and closed before the body could be presented to the family. First things first, Solomon said aloud to himself, a habit he developed over years of working alone in medical situations. Talking through procedures helped him think clearly and catch mistakes before they became serious problems. Need to wash the body thoroughly, assess the wound, and prepare the workspace. Can't start arterial injection until the surface is clean, and I know exactly what I'm working with. He filled a large zinc bucket with water from the basement pump, added a handful of chlorinated lime powder to create a weak disinfectant solution, and used rough cotton cloths to wash Captain Whitmore's body from head to feet. The water ran brown with dried blood and battlefield dirt, and the chlorinated lime produced a sharp chemical smell that overpowered the sweet rot odor of decomposition. The washing process revealed additional details that Solomon needed to account for. The captain's body showed signs of multiple injuries beyond the fatal chest wound. Bruising on the arms and legs from combat, a possible fractured rib on the left side that created an abnormal contour, and severe dehydration that had occurred in the hours before death as blood loss reduced circulating fluid volume. The dehydration was actually advantageous for embalming because it meant less blood to drain from the circulatory system. But the fractured rib would require careful positioning to avoid making the injury visible when the body was dressed in uniform for viewing. Solomon made mental notes about each issue, planning his approach to ensure the final result would be a body that looked peaceful, preserved, and suitable for the open casket funeral that Confederate families expected. The chest wound required immediate attention before arterial embalming could begin. The shrapnel had entered below the left clavicle, penetrated through the rib cage, and presumably severed major blood vessels, including the subclavian artery, causing rapid fatal hemorrhaging. Field medics had packed the wound with cotton cloth to stop external bleeding. But this packing had never been removed, and after 18 days, it was soaked with dried blood and beginning to breed infection. Solomon carefully extracted the packing using surgical forceps, cleaned the wound cavity with carbolic acid solution to kill bacteria, and examined the internal damage as much as possible without performing a complete autopsy that the family hadn't authorized and wouldn't want. Arteries definitely severed, Solomon muttered, probing gently with a metal rod to feel for the subclavian artery's proximal end. That's why he died so fast. Arterial blood loss, probably lost 2 to 3 liters in less than 5 minutes. Would have been unconscious within 30 seconds, dead within 2 minutes. Family can take some comfort in that at least. He didn't suffer long. This kind of forensic analysis, determining exactly how and how quickly someone died, was something Solomon had learned from Dr. Blandford, but had expanded through years of careful observation. Understanding death mechanics helped in embalming because different causes of death left bodies in different conditions that required different preservation approaches. Solomon sutured the chest wound closed using silk thread and a curved surgical needle. making small, precise stitches that pulled the torn tissue together without creating excessive tension that would cause the sutures to tear through. The wound was too large to close completely without distorting the chest shape, so Solomon packed it internally with cotton soaked in arsenic solution, a technique that would preserve tissue from the inside and prevent the wound from reopening during handling or transport. When he finished, the wound was barely visible beneath the captain's undershirt, and it would be completely concealed when the dress uniform was put on for viewing. This attention to cosmetic detail was part of what made Solomon's work valuable. Families wanted their deceased loved ones to look peaceful and intact, not damaged and disturbing. With the preliminary work complete, Solomon turned to arterial embalming, the core procedure that would determine whether Captain Whitmore's body could be successfully preserved for transport and burial. He positioned the body flat on the embalming table, with the head slightly elevated on a wooden block to improve fluid flow. He gathered his instruments, a surgical scalpel with a blade sharpened that morning using a whetstone, a brass trocar approximately 6 inches long with a tapered point, silk thread for ligatures, rubber tubing to connect the trocar to the gravity reservoir, and a glass observation tube that would allow him to monitor fluid flow and detect problems. The gravity reservoir, a large ceramic jug positioned on a shelf 3 feet above the table, contained 2 gallons of preservative solution that Solomon had mixed earlier. 4 pounds of arsenic trioxide dissolved in grain alcohol, diluted slightly with water to reduce viscosity and improve flow through smaller blood vessels. Solomon made his first incision in Captain Whitmore's right side of the neck, approximately 2 inches below the jaw, cutting through skin and subcutaneous tissue to expose the carotid artery and jugular vein. This required precise knife work, because the artery and vein ran parallel to each other, separated by only a few millimeters. And cutting the wrong vessel would ruin the embalming by allowing preservative to flow into the venous system instead of the arterial system. Solomon had watched Dr. Blandford perform this dissection approximately 80 times over the years, and had performed it himself under supervision perhaps 20 times. But this was the first time he was working completely independently, with no one to correct mistakes or provide guidance. "Arteries right there," Solomon said, using forceps to lift the blood vessels slightly away from surrounding tissue. "Need to make a small incision in the arterial wall, maybe 3 millimeters long, just enough to insert the trocar without tearing." He used the scalpel tip to create a tiny opening in the artery, watching as a small amount of dried blood oozed out. The blood was dark and viscous, almost black, because it had been sitting in the captain's circulatory system for 18 days and had partially clotted. Fresh blood from a recently deceased person would have been bright red and liquid. But old blood presented special challenges for embalming because it didn't drain easily and could block the flow of preservative fluid through smaller vessels. Solomon inserted the trocar through the arterial incision, advancing it carefully until he felt the instrument slide smoothly into the vessel lumen. He secured the trocar in position using a silk ligature tied around the artery, creating a watertight seal that would prevent leakage during the preservation process. Then he made a corresponding incision in the jugular vein 3 inches below the arterial insertion point, creating an opening through which blood would drain as preservative fluid was pumped through the arterial system. The vein incision didn't require a trocar insertion, just a simple cut that allowed passive drainage, and Solomon positioned a zinc collection bucket beneath the table to catch the drained blood. "Starting infusion now," Solomon announced to the empty basement, his voice steady despite the slight tremor in his hands, from adrenaline and awareness of the responsibility he carried. He opened the valve on the rubber tubing connecting the gravity reservoir to the arterial trocar, and preservative fluid began flowing immediately, driven by gravity pressure from the 3-foot height differential between reservoir and body. The fluid was visible through the glass observation tube that Solomon had installed in the tubing line, a clear liquid with a faint yellowish tint from the arsenic content. flow rate was approximately 1 pint every 10 minutes, which meant the 2 gallons in the reservoir would take roughly 80 minutes to infuse completely. Within 30 seconds of opening the valve, dark blood began draining from the jugular vein incision, flowing into the zinc bucket with a sound like water from a slow faucet. This was the desired response, confirmation that preservative fluid was successfully entering the arterial system and pushing blood out through the venous system. Solomon watched the drainage carefully, looking for any signs of problems. If blood flow stopped prematurely, it might indicate a blockage in the circulatory system that would prevent complete preservation. If blood continued flowing after the reservoir was empty, it might indicate the preservative wasn't staying in the tissues and was simply passing through without proper distribution. Looking good so far, Solomon muttered after 5 minutes of observation. The blood drainage was steady and continuous. The observation tube showed consistent fluid flow without air bubbles or blockages. And Captain Whitmore's skin color was already beginning to change from the gray-blue of decomposition to a more normal pinkish tone as preservative fluid replaced blood in the capillary beds. This color change was one of the most visible signs that embalming was working, and it would help make the captain look more lifelike when his family viewed the body. After 15 minutes, Solomon noticed that the drained blood was becoming lighter in color, more brown-red than black, indicating that the initial plugs of old clotted blood was being cleared from the system and fresher blood was now draining. The arterial infusion continued for 97 minutes, longer than Solomon had anticipated, but still within acceptable range given the body's condition and the 18-day delay between death and embalming. By the time the gravity reservoir was empty and no more preservative fluid was flowing through the observation tube, approximately 6 pints of blood had drained into the zinc bucket, representing roughly half of the captain's total blood volume. The remaining blood was either trapped in smaller vessels where it had clotted, absorbed into tissues, or lost during the 18 days between death and preservation. Solomon closed the valve, removed the trocar from the carotid artery, and sutured both the arterial and venous incisions closed using silk thread and the same precise stitching technique he'd used on the chest wound. But arterial embalming alone wouldn't be sufficient to preserve Captain Whitmore's body for the 2-day journey to Hanover County, followed by several days of viewing before burial. The abdomen showed significant bloating from gases produced by intestinal bacteria during the 18 days of decomposition. And these bacteria needed to be killed, and the gases removed to prevent the body from rupturing during transport. This required cavity treatment, a second phase of embalming that involved aspirating fluids and gases from the abdominal and thoracic cavities, then injecting concentrated preservative directly into those spaces to saturate organ surfaces that hadn't been reached by arterial infusion. Solomon selected a different trocar for cavity treatment. This one approximately 14 inches long with a sharper, more rigid point, capable of penetrating through the abdominal wall into the peritoneal cavity. He positioned the trocar 2 inches above Captain Whitmore's navel, angled it at approximately 45 degrees toward the pelvis, and pushed firmly but carefully until he felt the resistance change as the point penetrated through the abdominal wall. Immediately, gas under pressure began escaping through the hollow trocar with a soft hissing sound and a smell that was intensely foul, a combination of hydrogen sulfide, methane, and various organic compounds produced by bacterial fermentation of intestinal contents. Solomon had encountered this smell dozens of times while assisting Dr. Blandford, but it never became tolerable, and he involuntarily turned his head away while the gas vented. Once the gas pressure equalized, Solomon connected the trocar to a manual vacuum pump, a brass device with a piston that created suction when operated. He pumped the handle 15 times, each stroke withdrawing fluid from the abdominal cavity. A mixture of blood that had pooled there, liquefied tissue from organ decomposition, bile from the liver, and intestinal contents that had leaked through degraded intestinal walls. The fluid was dark brown, almost black, and had a consistency between water and syrup. Approximately 1 quart collected in the vacuum flask before Solomon determined that most of the cavity fluid had been removed. He disconnected the vacuum pump, inserted a large syringe filled with concentrated arsenic solution through the same trocar, and injected approximately 1 pint of preservative directly into the abdominal cavity. The thoracic cavity, containing the heart and lungs, required similar treatment. Solomon inserted the cavity trocar below the sternum, angled it upward toward the chest, and repeated the aspiration and injection process. The lungs had partially collapsed and were filled with fluid from decomposition, which the vacuum pump removed before concentrated preservative was injected to saturate the lung tissue and kill remaining bacteria. The heart, already empty of blood from the arterial embalming, required only a small injection of preservative directly into the cardiac chambers to ensure complete preservation. When Solomon withdrew the trocar and sutured the insertion sites closed, Captain Thomas Whitmore's body was as thoroughly preserved as 1862 embalming technology could achieve. The entire process, from initial washing to final suturing, had taken 4 hours and 23 minutes. Solomon stood back from the embalming table, his hands cramping from the sustained precision work, his back aching from bending over the table, his clothes soaked with sweat from working in the poorly ventilated basement in July heat. But the work was complete, and the result was remarkably successful. Captain Whitmore looked peaceful. His skin tone was natural rather than gray. The bloating had been reduced to barely noticeable levels, and the preservative treatment would keep the body stable for at least 2 weeks, more than enough time for transport to Hanover County and a proper funeral with open casket viewing. "Solomon, the family's here to view the body," Dr. Blanford announced from the basement stairs at approximately 3 p.m., his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that suggested he was pleased with the outcome, even though he hadn't participated in the actual work. "Make him presentable for viewing." Solomon had already dressed Captain Whitmore in a clean Confederate officer's uniform that the family had provided, complete with insignia indicating his rank and regiment. He'd positioned the body in a pine coffin lined with sawdust, arranged the captain's hands across his chest in a pose suggesting peaceful rest, and combed the captain's hair into the style shown in a photograph the family had provided. The presentation was dignified, respectful, and professionally executed. The Whitmore family descended the basement stairs 5 minutes later. The captain's father, Thomas Whitmore, Sr., age 57, a plantation owner from Hanover County. The captain's mother, Elizabeth, age 52, and 2 sisters, ages 19 and 23. All 4 were dressed in formal mourning clothes, black dresses for the women and black suit for the father. And all showed the red eyes and drawn faces of people who'd been crying for weeks. They approached the coffin slowly, hesitantly, clearly dreading what they might see. And Solomon stood respectfully in the corner, silent and nearly invisible, as enslaved people were expected to be in the presence of grieving white families. Elizabeth Whitmore reached the coffin first, looked down at her son's face, and gasped softly. For a moment, Solomon thought something was wrong, that he'd made some terrible mistake in his preservation work. But then the mother touched her son's face gently and said, "He looks just like he's sleeping. Thomas, come look. Our boy looks peaceful." The father approached, placed his hand on his son's uniform, and nodded with visible relief. The sisters crowded in, both crying, but also clearly comforted by seeing their brother looking whole and at rest, rather than torn apart and decomposed, as they must have feared. "Dr. Blanford, this is miraculous work," Thomas Whitmore, Sr. said. turning to address Blandford, who stood near the stairs accepting credit for Solomon's labor. We were terrified about what condition we'd find him in after 18 days. But he looks like himself. Thank you for giving us the chance to say proper goodbye. Blandford nodded graciously, made appropriate condolences, and accepted the family's gratitude without mentioning Solomon's name or acknowledging that every aspect of the embalming had been performed by an enslaved man standing silent in the corner. The Whitmore family departed 30 minutes later, taking Captain Thomas Whitmore's preserved body in a sealed wagon for the 2-day journey to Hanover County. Dr. Blandford escorted them upstairs, handled the final paperwork and payment collection, and returned to the basement where Solomon was cleaning instruments and disposing of the drained blood and cavity fluids. Blandford counted out 2 silver dollars from his pocket and handed them to Solomon without comment or praise. $2 for 4 hours and 23 minutes of skilled medical labor that few people in Virginia could perform. $2 that would be hidden with the other small amounts Solomon had accumulated over years of similar transactions. $2 that represented one tiny step toward the impossible goal of purchasing freedom. But something had changed during those 4 hours in the basement. Solomon had proved to himself that he could perform embalming independently without Dr. Blandford's supervision. He demonstrated skill that equaled or exceeded what most trained white undertakers could achieve. And he'd begun calculating a possibility that hadn't seemed real before. If Confederate battles continued producing casualties at the rate the 7 days battles had produced them, there would be hundreds, possibly thousands, of bodies that needed embalming over the next months or years. If Solomon could embalm even a fraction of those bodies at $2 each, he might accumulate enough money to purchase freedom within years rather than decades. The mathematics suddenly seemed achievable rather than fantasy. $2 per body, 6 bodies per week, 624 per year. After 3 years, 1,272 hours. Enough to buy himself, possibly enough to buy his wife and children too if he could negotiate the price down. Solomon Richards walked home from the Blandford church basement that evening carrying 2 silver dollars in his pocket, and a plan forming in his mind that would either lead to freedom or get him sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama where the hard labor and brutal conditions would kill him within 5 years. The risk was enormous. The potential reward was everything he'd never had. Ownership of himself, protection for his family, the ability to work as a free man and keep what he earned. All he needed was 312 more Confederate soldiers to die, their families to pay for embalming, and 3 years of carefully hiding money from an owner who could reclaim it at any moment. In the photograph taken that morning, Solomon Richards stands beside Captain Thomas Whitmore's body with his hands positioned on the embalming table, his face showing the practiced neutrality that enslaved people wore like armor. What the photograph doesn't show is what Solomon was thinking during that 50-second exposure. That this was the first body of what would eventually be hundreds, that the captain's death might contribute to Solomon's freedom, and that history's darkest ironies sometimes involve enslaved people using the deaths of their enslavers to purchase the right to be human. Chapter 2. The pattern that began with Captain Thomas Whitmore's body on July 19, 1862, accelerated rapidly as the Civil War intensified, and Confederate casualties mounted across Virginia's battlefields. Solomon Richards embalmed 6 more officers during the final 2 weeks of July, earning $12 that he hid in a glass jar buried beneath a loose floorboard in the Blandford church basement. August brought 11 bodies from skirmishes around Petersburg and Richmond, adding $22 to his hidden funds. September produced 14 bodies as the Battle of Antietam created over 22,000 combined casualties. And desperate families throughout Virginia sought embalming services for their dead sons and husbands. By the end of September 1862, Solomon had preserved 31 Confederate soldiers in 10 weeks, accumulated $62 in hidden silver and gold coins, and established a reputation among Petersburg's undertaking community as the most skilled embalmer in the region. Even though almost no one knew his name because Dr. Blandford took credit for all the work. The technical challenges varied with each body. Some casualties arrived within 48 hours of death, fresh enough that arterial embalming alone was sufficient for preservation. Others, like Captain Whitmore, had been buried for days or weeks before exhumation, requiring extensive cavity treatment and additional chemical preservation to overcome advanced decomposition. Solomon developed a classification system based on time elapsed since death and condition upon arrival. Class A bodies were less than 3 days dead with minimal decomposition, requiring 2 hours of standard embalming at $2 per body. Class B bodies were 3 to 7 days dead with moderate decomposition, requiring 3 hours of work with additional cavity treatment at $3 per body if families would pay extra. Class C bodies were over 7 days dead with severe decomposition, requiring 4 to 5 hours of intensive work at $5 per body, when Solomon could convince Dr. Blandford to charge premium rates. "Dr. Blandford, we need to talk about pricing," Solomon said on October 3, 1862. After finishing a particularly difficult Class C embalming of a major who'd been dead for 12 days when his body was recovered from a swamp near Malvern Hill. Solomon had spent 6 hours on the major's preservation, using double the normal amount of arsenic solution and performing extensive cosmetic reconstruction to make the severely decomposed face presentable for family viewing. The major's father had paid $25 for the service, an extraordinary sum that reflected both the family's wealth and their desperation to have a viewable body for the funeral. Dr. Blandford had given Solomon his standard $2 payment, keeping $23 for himself despite not participating in any aspect of the actual work. "What about pricing?" Blandford asked, his tone suggesting he knew exactly what Solomon was going to say, when wasn't particularly interested in hearing it. They were in the church basement, Solomon cleaning instruments while Blandford prepared paperwork for the next day's scheduled embalming. The October afternoon light was fading, and shadows from the ground-level windows created long, dark shapes across the stone floor. Solomon chose his words carefully, maintaining the deferential tone that white Virginians expected while simultaneously pushing for economic terms that recognized his value. "Sir, I've been thinking about the time involved in different types of embalming work," Solomon said, keeping his eyes on the instruments he was cleaning rather than looking directly at Blandford. "A fresh body takes maybe 2 hours. A body that's been dead a week takes 4 or 5 hours, sometimes more. The major I just finished took 6 hours of concentrated work, and you charged his family $25. I received $2, same as I get for a 2-hour job. That doesn't seem proportional to the effort required." The statement was factual rather than confrontational, presenting an economic argument that Blandford might accept, even if he wouldn't accept a moral argument about fairness or exploitation. Dr. Blandford was silent for approximately 30 seconds, considering the proposal. He was a practical man who understood that Solomon's skills were generating significant income, and that losing Solomon's labor would mean losing that income stream. But he was also a slaveholder who'd spent his entire life in a system where enslaved people didn't negotiate wages or demand proportional compensation. The tension between these two realities created a decision point. Refuse Solomon's request and risk resentment that might affect work quality, or accept a modified payment structure that acknowledged Solomon's value while maintaining the fundamental power imbalance of ownership. "What are you proposing?" Blandford finally asked, his tone neutral but interested. Solomon recognized this as an opening, a signal that negotiation was possible if terms were presented carefully. He'd been planning this conversation for 2 weeks, calculating various payment structures and trying to identify an arrangement that would benefit both parties enough to be acceptable. 3-tier system based on body condition, Solomon said, speaking quickly before Blandford could interrupt. Fresh bodies under 3 days old, standard $15 charge to families. I get $2. You keep $13? That's our current arrangement for most cases. Bodies 3 to 7 days old, $20 charge to families. I get $4. You keep $16. Bodies over 7 days old or requiring extensive reconstruction, $25 charge to families. I get $6. You keep $19. You make more money on difficult cases. I get paid proportionally for the extra time and skill required. Everybody benefits. The proposal was carefully constructed to emphasize Blandford's financial gain rather than Solomon's increased earnings, framing the negotiation as a business decision rather than a moral question about enslaved labor compensation. Blandford considered the proposal for another 30 seconds, calculating the potential income increase against the philosophical discomfort of paying enslaved property higher wages. The mathematics won. Agreed, Blandford said abruptly. But I control the pricing decisions. You don't get to tell families what we charge. I assess the body, set the price, and you get your percentage based on the agreed structure. And Solomon. He paused for emphasis. This arrangement stays between us. Other slaveholders hear I'm paying my property premium wages, they'll cause problems for both of us. Understood? Solomon nodded immediately, understanding that the secrecy served both their interests. Blandford avoided criticism from other slaveholders who might see his payment structure as dangerously progressive, while Solomon avoided drawing attention that might cause Blandford to revoke the arrangement or sell him to someone less accommodating. The new payment structure transformed Solomon's earning potential. Between October 1862 and March 1863, he embalmed 47 bodies, 23 Class A at $2 each, 46, 18 Class B at $4 each, 72, and 6 Class C at $6 each, 36, for total earnings of $154 in 6 months. Combined with the $62 he'd earned during July through September, Solomon had accumulated $216 by March 1863, less than 9 months after beginning his embalming work. At this rate, he calculated he could reach $200 within 3 years, enough to purchase his own freedom at the value Dr. Blandford had established in estate documents. But purchasing freedom for himself while leaving his wife Eliza and 3 children enslaved was morally unacceptable. And purchasing the entire family would require approximately $2,000 based on standard Virginia slave valuations, $900 for Solomon himself. Reduced from $200 because he was now 35 and aging out of prime working years, $400 for Eliza, age 32, skilled house servant, and $700 for 3 children aged 6, 9, and 12. The mathematics of reaching $2,000 required either working faster, earning more per body, or finding additional income sources beyond Dr. Blandford's operation. The solution arrived unexpectedly in April 1863, when a Confederate officer named Major William Ashford visited the Blandford church basement and made Solomon a proposition that would double his income and eventually lead to freedom. Major Ashford was 39 years old, had served in the Army of Northern Virginia since 1861, and had recently been assigned to Confederate medical services, coordinating burial and preservation of officer casualties. He'd heard about the skilled embalmer working in Petersburg, had assumed it was Dr. Blandford, and had come to discuss establishing a field embalming station near Richmond to handle the increasing volume of casualties from active campaigns. Dr. Blandford, I need someone who can process 20 bodies per week during major engagements, Ashford explained, standing in the basement while Solomon worked on a captain's body in the background. Your facility here is excellent, but it's too far from Richmond where most casualties are concentrated. I'm establishing a field station in a tobacco warehouse 3 miles from Chimborazo Hospital. I need an embalmer who can work fast, work independently, and handle high volume. I'll pay $15 per body to your operation, same rate you charge families. But I need guaranteed capacity of 20 bodies weekly during active campaigns. Can you handle that? Dr. Blanford started to answer, then hesitated, recognizing that his arthritis and age made it impossible for him to personally embalm 20 bodies per week. He glanced at Solomon working at the embalming table, and Major Ashford followed his gaze. "Is that your assistant?" Ashford asked, walking closer to observe Solomon's work. Solomon was performing arterial injection on a lieutenant who died 3 days earlier at Chancellorsville, working with the efficient precision that came from 8 months of intensive practice. Ashford watched for approximately 2 minutes, noting the steady hand placement, the careful monitoring of fluid flow, and the professional confidence that Solomon demonstrated despite being enslaved property rather than trained physician. "How long has he been doing this work?" Ashford asked Blanford, though he was looking at Solomon when he spoke. 6 years assisting me, 8 months working independently," Blanford answered, the truth slightly exaggerated to make Solomon's experience sound more impressive. "He's skilled, fast, and reliable. Most of the work you've heard about coming from this facility is actually Solomon's work. I supervise and handle family consultations, but he performs the technical embalming." This admission, that an enslaved man was responsible for the quality that had built Blanford's reputation, was remarkable coming from a Virginia slaveholder in 1863. But Ashford's military authority and the desperate need for embalming services made honesty more valuable than maintaining racial pretenses. Major Ashford made a decision that would change Solomon's trajectory. "Dr. Blanford, I'm going to make you an unusual proposal. I need Solomon working at my Richmond field station 4 days per week, operating independently without your supervision. He'll process officer casualties under my authority. I'll pay your operation directly, and you can continue running your Petersburg facility however you choose. I'll pay $15 per body. Solomon can handle approximately 20 bodies per week. That's $300 weekly to your operation during active campaign periods. You keep whatever percentage you normally keep. Solomon gets his usual payment, and everybody benefits from the volume." The proposal was extraordinary because it involved Solomon working without white supervision, something that violated numerous Virginia customs about enslaved labor. But Major Ashford had military authority that superseded civilian conventions, and the Confederacy's desperate need for embalming services made pragmatism more important than ideology. Dr. Blanford agreed immediately, recognizing that $300 per week during active campaigns represented more income than his entire Petersburg operation generated in a month. He negotiated one condition: Solomon would receive his standard tiered payment, $4 or $6 per body depending on condition, while Blanford would keep the remainder, resulting in Blanford earning approximately $250 weekly from Solomon's Richmond work, while personally performing little or no labor. The arrangement was exploitative by any reasonable standard, but it was also an opportunity that Solomon seized because it meant higher volume, faster accumulation of funds, and experience working in a military medical facility that might create additional opportunities later. The Richmond Field Embalming Station opened on May 1, 1863, in a converted tobacco warehouse that Confederate Medical Services had requisitioned for $40 monthly rent. The facility contained 6 wooden embalming tables, shelving for 200 coffins, a chemical mixing area where Solomon could prepare preservative solutions in 50-gallon batches, and a dedicated workspace for cosmetic reconstruction of severely damaged bodies. Major Ashford had equipped the facility with proper medical instruments rather than the improvised tools Solomon had been using in Petersburg. Surgical scalpels made from Sheffield steel, brass trocars in 3 different sizes, rubber tubing that didn't leak, glass observation tubes for monitoring fluid flow, and sufficient supplies of arsenic, alcohol, and other preservatives to handle sustained high-volume operations. Solomon's first week at the Richmond facility processed 23 bodies from the Battle of Chancellorsville, Confederate casualties who'd been held in field hospitals for initial treatment, then transported to Richmond when preservation became necessary. The volume was overwhelming initially, but Solomon developed process improvements that increased efficiency without sacrificing quality. He trained 2 enslaved assistants to handle preliminary work, washing bodies, removing clothing, preparing coffins, and disposing of drained blood and cavity fluids. This allowed Solomon to focus on the skilled technical work of arterial injection and cavity treatment, while the assistants performed time-consuming but less complex tasks. Standard embalming time decreased from 2 hours per body to 90 minutes through careful workflow optimization. Solomon, we've got 17 incoming from Cold Harbor, Major Ashford announced on June 4, 1864, the day after a battle where 7,000 Union soldiers had been killed or wounded in less than an hour of concentrated fighting, with Confederate casualties numbered at approximately 1,500. All officers, all requiring immediate embalming for family transport. Some of these families are paying $20 to $25 per body because they're wealthy and desperate. I'm authorizing premium rates across the board. You'll process all 17 in the next 72 hours, and I'm paying you $7 per body directly, in gold coin, separate from the standard arrangement with Dr. Blandford. That's $119 for 3 days' work. You interested? The proposal was remarkable for several reasons. First, it meant Major Ashford would pay Solomon directly rather than routing payment through Dr. Blandford, effectively recognizing Solomon as an independent contractor, despite his enslaved status. Second, the payment was in gold coin, rather than increasingly worthless Confederate paper currency, protecting the value against the inflation that was devastating the Southern economy. Third, $119 for 72 hours of work was more money than Solomon had earned in his first 6 months of embalming, representing a concentration of income that would dramatically accelerate his timeline for purchasing freedom. I'm very interested, Major. Solomon answered immediately, calculating that this single 3-day operation would bring his total accumulated funds to approximately $650, over 1/3 of what he needed for his entire family's freedom. But I need authorization in writing that I'm working under Confederate military authority. Dr. Blandford might object to you paying me directly, and I need legal protection against accusations of working independently without my owner's permission. The request demonstrated Solomon's understanding of the legal vulnerabilities that enslaved people faced, even when performing authorized work, and Major Ashford immediately recognized the wisdom of providing written protection. The Cold Harbor operation ran for 72 hours straight. Solomon and 2 assistants working in rotating 8-hour shifts, processing 17 officers whose families had paid premium rates for rapid embalming and transport. The work was physically exhausting, each 8-hour shift involving 5 to 6 complete embalmings performed with sustained concentration, because any mistake could ruin a body and create problems with grieving families. Solomon's hands developed cramps from the repetitive surgical work. His back ached from bending over embalming tables, and his eyes burned from the chemical fumes that filled the warehouse despite ventilation efforts. But the financial reward was transformative. $119 in gold coins, paid directly by Major Ashford at the end of the 3rd day, representing more purchasing power than most free workers earned in 6 months. Between May 1863 and September 1864, Solomon operated the Richmond Field Embalming Station 4 days per week, while continuing to work at Dr. Blandford's Petersburg facility 3 days per week. The combined operations processed approximately 180 bodies during those 16 months, earning Solomon roughly $720 through his regular tiered payment arrangement with Blandford, plus an additional $340 from direct payments by Major Ashford for premium rush work during major battles. By September 1864, Solomon had accumulated 1,076 in gold and silver coins hidden in 3 separate locations: a jar buried beneath the Richmond warehouse floor, another jar hidden in the Petersburg church basement, and a cloth bag concealed in the woodwork of the small cabin where he lived with his family. The accumulated funds represented 27 months of intense labor preserving Confederate dead, and they brought freedom within achievable reach. But accumulating money wasn't sufficient for purchasing freedom. Solomon also needed Dr. Blandford to agree to the transaction, and Virginia law in 1864 made voluntary manumission increasingly difficult as the Confederacy tightened controls on enslaved populations fearful of rebellion or mass escape to Union lines. The negotiation began on September 15, 1864, when Dr. Blandford discovered that Solomon had been receiving direct payments from Major Ashford and demanded renegotiation of their financial arrangement. "You've been taking money behind my back," Blandford accused, his anger genuine but moderated by the realization that Solomon's work had made Blandford wealthy. "Everything you earn belongs to me legally. I should confiscate whatever you've hidden and sell you to an Alabama cotton plantation for violating our agreement." The threat was credible, but Solomon had prepared for this confrontation. "Dr. Blandford, I understand your position," Solomon said carefully, maintaining respectful tone while presenting an alternative that served both their interests. "You own me at $900 current valuation, according to your updated estate papers. I've accumulated $1,276 through the embalming work you authorized. I'm proposing that I purchase my freedom for $900 cash, paid immediately. You receive your full property value back in gold and silver, I receive freedom, and we both benefit. If you refuse and sell me to Alabama, you get maybe $800 for a 36-year-old skilled worker in a depressed market, and you lose all future income from my embalming work. If you accept my proposal, you get $900 immediately, plus the opportunity to hire me as free labor for continued embalming work at whatever wages we negotiate." The counter-proposal transformed a confrontation into a business negotiation. Dr. Blandford considered the offer for 3 days, consulted with lawyers about the legality and process of self-purchase manumission, and eventually accepted with expanded terms. Solomon would pay $900 for his own freedom, plus an additional $600 to purchase his wife Eliza and their 3 children, for total payment of $2,500. The amount would leave Solomon with approximately $500 remaining from his accumulated funds, enough to establish independent operations and support his family during the transition to free status. On September 22, 1864, Solomon Richards paid $500 in gold and silver coins to Dr. Charles Blandford and received manumission papers that legally freed himself, his wife Eliza, and their children James, age 13, Margaret, age 10, and Samuel, age 7. The transaction was recorded in Petersburg city records as voluntary manumission through self-purchase of skilled medical assistant Solomon Richards and family. Total consideration, $1,500 paid in coin. The documentation included specific notation that Solomon had earned the money through authorized embalming work for Confederate medical services and private clients, providing legal protection against any future claims that the money had been obtained illegally. This documentation would prove crucial 5 months later, when Confederate authorities attempted to reverse some wartime manumissions under emergency legislation. But Solomon successfully defended his free status by producing the purchase records and demonstrating that his freedom was obtained through legitimate commercial transaction. Between September 1864 and April 1865, Solomon continued working as an embalmer, now as a free man negotiating his own wages rather than as enslaved property receiving minimal payment. He charged $10 per standard embalming, $15 for moderate difficulty cases, and $20 for extensive reconstruction work, rates that were competitive with white undertakers while reflecting Solomon's superior skill and efficiency. Major Ashford continued using Solomon's services through the final months of the war, and several Petersburg families who'd been satisfied with previous work sought Solomon directly rather than going through Dr. Blandford. Solomon processed 91 additional bodies during those 7 months, earning approximately $100 that he used to purchase a small house in Petersburg's free black neighborhood and establish the equipment and supplies necessary for independent undertaking business. The total accounting across 33 months of wartime embalming. 312 Confederate soldiers preserved by a man who started as enslaved property and ended as free businessman. Financial breakdown: approximately $4,780 earned through embalming work, $500 used for purchasing family freedom, $100 earned during 7 months of free labor, $500 remaining capital plus house and business equipment, valued at approximately $800. The mathematics that had seemed impossible in July 1862 had become reality by April 1865. Freedom purchased through skilled labor, a family united in free status, and independent business established in a rapidly changing society. When Petersburg fell to Union forces on April 2, 1865, and the Confederacy collapsed 7 days later with Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Solomon Richards was positioned uniquely among formerly enslaved people. He owned his home, operated an established business, had accumulated capital and equipment, and possessed skills that were valuable regardless of which government controlled Virginia. He transitioned seamlessly from Confederate military embalmer to civilian undertaker serving Petersburg's free black community, a population of approximately 3,000 formerly enslaved people, who suddenly needed all the services that white society had provided or denied, depending on economic calculation and racial prejudice. Solomon operated Richard's undertaking from 1865 until his death in 1893 at age 65. Business records show he embalmed approximately 3,400 bodies over 28 years, charging fees that ranged from $5 for pauper burials to $50 for elaborate funerals with extended preservation and cosmetic work. He trained 7 apprentices, 6 of them formerly enslaved people who had no other access to skilled trades, teaching embalming techniques and business practices that allowed them to establish their own operations across Virginia. His wife Eliza managed business finances and client relations, developing the administrative systems that made Richard's undertaking one of Petersburg's most successful black-owned businesses. Their 3 children all learned the trade. James became an undertaker in Richmond. Margaret married and moved to Philadelphia, where she worked with black funeral homes in that city. And Samuel took over the Petersburg business when Solomon died. The wooden embalming table that Solomon used in Dr. Blandford's basement during the war years, the same table visible in the July 1862 photograph, survived and was donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1947 by Samuel Richards, Jr., Solomon's grandson. The donation included the table, several glass bottles that had contained arsenic preservative, 3 brass trocars of different sizes, and the leather-bound ledger where Solomon had secretly recorded every Confederate officer he'd embalmed between July 1862 and April 1865. The ledger lists 312 names with dates, regiments, causes of death, and payments received, creating a unique historical document that chronicles Confederate casualties from the perspective of an enslaved embalmer working to purchase his freedom. The photograph taken on July 19, 1862, showing Solomon standing beside Captain Thomas Whitmore's body in the Blandford Church basement, was captured by Union forces when Petersburg fell in April 1865. The image was catalogued by the Library of Congress as Enslaved Embalmer Preparing Confederate Casualty, Petersburg, Virginia, 1862, and remains in their photographic archives. Modern historians have used the photograph, combined with Solomon's ledger and surviving business records, to document the economics of self-purchase during the Civil War era, the role of skilled enslaved labor in Confederate medical services, and the pathways through which some enslaved people achieved freedom through accumulating capital in wartime economies. Dr. Charles Blandford died in 1867 at age 73, 2 years after selling Solomon Richards his freedom, and 2 years after the Confederacy's collapse ended the slave system that had sustained Blandford's wealth. Estate records show Blandford received $1,500 from Solomon's manumission transaction, invested most of it in Confederate bonds that became worthless when the South lost the war, and died with assets valued at approximately $200. Solomon Richards, who Blandford had valued at $900 and sold his freedom for that price, died 26 years later with assets valued at approximately $8,000, including his house, business equipment, and accumulated capital from 28 years of independent operation. 312 Confederate soldiers embalmed between July 1862 and April 1865. Average payment $15 per body. Total earnings $4,680. Self-purchase of family freedom $1,500. One enslaved man who recognized that desperate white families would pay for skills they couldn't get elsewhere. 33 months of preserving bodies of men who died fighting to keep him enslaved. One family freed through the deaths of their enslavers. That's what happened.